Novak Djokovic is a hero in the eyes of many people because of his stance on vaccination and bodily autonomy. Some people may not like the association with regards to his status and his ongoing performance at this age, but I couldn't help but reflect carefully on where he is now and why he is still there, and many of his compatriots around a similar age have disappeared from the scene. And this is why I make reference to his status. And I actually did do some research on this, and I'm going to be sharing with you some ideas. And for those people who are struggling, because I only realized how many people are struggling with joint and tendon issues, there is a link in the description for you to use to join me as I continue to explore the science and try and find solutions. But let's look at what happened in the news. It was primarily because of this news story. He beat a British tennis player, so he ends Norris' run to advance in Paris. And so he is now in the quarterfinals of the French Open. And eh, at the rate he's going, he may end up becoming the greatest. He's bidding for a standalone 25th Grand Slam singles title. And this is incredible for a player who is not young. And when we think of the other greats who are around at the time, Federer, you have Nadal, Andy Murray, they are no longer on the scene. And the question is, could it be related to his stance on bodily autonomy? And I'm going to explain to you a little bit of what I think that science could be that explains why he is still around and many others aren't. So let's get into what I consider to be the science about what was going on. And as I said, if you're struggling with joint tendon issues, this is relevant to you. And I'll go into more detail at a different presentation. So let's just go through some of the simple concepts. One of the things that impacted almost all of his compatriots were injuries. It's not that Djokovic didn't have injuries as well, say in 2024, but he seemed to recover quite quickly and much more comprehensively than many other compatriots. There may be a reason for this. So follow the science here. Let's break it down into simple pieces. The first thing is that you have to realize that injuries, especially with elite athletes, are very often around tendons and joints. And in this image here, I've highlighted muscle and tendon. So this here is the muscle in red. This is the tendon going down to the heel. And the tendon is gray. And I've highlighted here some inflammation in that tendon. And we're going to come back to this in just a minute or in a few minutes. But you have to realize that for many elite athletes, it doesn't matter what sport they're in, football, tennis, athletics, very often what causes them to be unable to perform long term are tendon injuries, sometimes much more so than muscle injuries. And for many people who are suffering with pain, they don't realize that their problem may be more to do with tendons around the joints than it's necessarily the joint. And this is why I'm saying it requires some thought and exploration of the science. So it's not that Djokovic isn't at risk because I'm linking this with COVID. This is where the unique link comes in. But I'm comparing two things: COVID infection and COVID vaccination. The interesting thing that people forget is that usually, if you have natural immunity, in most people, unless you have interferon autoantibodies, single infection usually means you are largely protected for a long period of time. Now, immunity does wane, so it's not that people can't have multiple infections, but they are usually quite mild. And that's because of this mucosal barrier. It's an immune system in an immune system. It's like the skin. Your skin is that protective barrier on the surface of your body. Without skin, your immune system would have to work tremendously hard to keep out bacteria. So, in the same way, the upper airway has like a skin in terms of that mucosal immune system that prevents viruses and bacteria breaking through. Where all of the problems exist with COVID are when the virus breaks through to get into your systemic immunity. Very important point. And so it's not that people who are unvaccinated have no risk. It's just that they seem to have less risk. And there was a Cleveland study paper that was done that really annoys people who are talking about the narrative, but this is just the facts. When they looked at the risk of infection after booster vaccines, you can see from 0 doses, 1, 2, 3, greater than 3 doses, the infection risk was highest with the highest doses. Now, this was not severe disease, they just got infected. That's a whole different discussion as to why this is occurring in the highly vaccinated population. It's oftentimes about interferon and interferon suppression and so on, but that is a separate discussion. But the fact is, they seem to have a higher risk at a population level of getting infections. Good. Let's get down to the nitty gritty now. When we think of inflammation, and what I explain to people is that COVID is like spraying petrol on pre existing inflammation. So, an inflammatory focus is usually quite stable. This is why you don't have any symptoms. And I describe it like this, where this is what happens in TB: very stable inflammation. All the bacteria are locked in the center. They have all these immune cells around it. Everybody is happy. The bacteria can't get out. The immune cells keep them in, and you don't have any symptoms. And this is a similar pattern as to what happens with most inflammatory processes, where there is a balance between your effector immune cells, these are the cells that like to cause fights, and your regulatory immune cells. These are like the peacekeepers, almost like the women in the bar telling people, just settle down, don't fight. And so there are very important balance that exists. And when it goes out of balance, you end up with inflammation. And in this picture here, I am demonstrating on the right here is stable. And on the left here is where some of the regulatory cells have been taken out. And suddenly you have an imbalance with inflammation. That then causes an inflammatory response. Now, what's important to recognize here is that in this presentation here, I'm highlighting that it is not that the COVID infection caused the inflammation necessarily. It just reduced the regulatory cells, took them out, and so therefore inflammation occurs naturally because there is a balance. And this is what I mean, is that a lot of people don't understand that if you have underlying inflammatory processes, if this gets out of balance, that's where you start to get symptoms. This is what it looks like. Remember, as I said, the effector cells are the ones who like to fight and they're pushing for inflammation. But on the other side, you have the regulatory cells that are keeping it in balance. And everything here is calm, even though there is inflammation. And so then you have a situation where when COVID, or in some cases the COVID vaccine comes along, you can then have a situation where the inflammation is taken out of position. Now, some people may argue that there is no evidence that this is the case. This is just purely theoretical. Well, as I said, what I do is I look for what is relevant in terms of the science, and I'm going to be showing you this here. Let me just get it a little bit bigger. So this here is a paper that's still in preprint. It's from Korea, and this is from 2022. And they have put the question straight away: correlation between COVID-19 vaccination and inflammatory musculoskeletal disorders. So they were looking at this broadly across Korea, and I'll show you the bit in a second. They were looking at this across Korea, and they used a pretty large cohort of people. So it's not a small study. And they were looking at about 2.2 million people across Korea between the 1st of January 2021, 12 weeks after the second dose, up to the 30th of September 2021, comparing them to the unvaccinated, the vaccinated, and the unvaccinated. So you can see how controversial this paper is. And no surprise, it's not been published. So it's been left in the preprint state for the longest while. And so now we still, therefore, can't say, well, it has gone through the whole process. But the point that I'm making here is that based on what they found with this paper, and I'm just trying to see if I can get to some of the images here, where it shows you that in their case they found a significant inflammatory process that occurred in relation to vaccination. And you can see here individuals who received COVID vaccines, either mRNA, viral vector, or mixing and matching, were found to be more likely to be diagnosed with inflammatory musculoskeletal disorder compared to those who were not. And this is what they found when they looked at a pretty large population in Korea. And it's correlating with what I'm saying in terms of elite players. Now, they may not want to acknowledge this, because can you imagine acknowledging these were some of the healthiest people? They were fit, they were young, they were healthy. Why in the world did they mandate them? I just really cannot understand what anybody was thinking at the time, because you just put them at risk when they had such a low risk of severe disease. And when we now look back at this and we see that they may, in effect, be suffering from the consequences. And remember, we're talking about professionals who have invested their whole life into their sport. And for them to be taken out because of this kind of thing is almost unconscionable. I can't I hope they are not watching this, because it will just get people annoyed to imagine that this is what could be happening. But coming back to the science here, when you have that damage to the regulatory cells, suddenly these T regulatory cells become dysfunctional. And when they become dysfunctional, they can't keep the other inflammatory cells in check. And that's essentially what I think is happening in terms of these joint and inflammatory disorders. And so then you have, where there was pre-existing inflammation, you have a situation where, because the regulatory cells, these gray ones, are no longer working effectively, suddenly, naturally, the whole system shifts to an inflammatory profile. And this could be why so many people are suffering with these joint and tendon pains. And actually, many people don't realize that what they think they have is joint pain may actually be tendon pain, tendinitis, that is causing all of the symptoms of the aches and the pains. And if that's what you are suffering with, you probably need to make sure you fill out that survey. But in summary, back to the basics, this is what I think has happened to some of his vaccinated cohorts. In the tennis arena, Novak was therefore, he was injured, but his inflammation would settle down quickly. But for cohorts who the inflammation doesn't settle quickly, suddenly they can no longer perform at their best. They can still play tennis, but not at a serious competitive level. And they would then have to step back, which leaves the doors open for Novak to possibly continue for another maybe 2 or 3 years. Can you believe that? Can you imagine what those other tennis players are thinking now? Where if he continues playing for another few years, he of course will become the greatest tennis player in history. This is the reality. He is still healthy. He is less likely to have any of these inflammatory issues. He's been taking care of himself. He's now in the quarterfinals of the French Open. We wish him all the best, because he did inspire a lot of people across the world to hold their line. And when they did, they were ultimately vindicated as he has been. So this is an important point. And for you, how it's relevant is that you may be suffering from these long-term joint and tendon issues. I was surprised the kind of response that I got when asked about this kind of thing. I thought people's fatigue would be the biggest issue. No, it was joint and tendon issues because it impacts your daily life. It impacts the sports you play. It impacts how far you can walk in the supermarket. It impacts whether or not you can climb a tree with your children. There are so many things that are impacted by this that we have to find ways to mitigate it. Remember, what we're doing here is to try and find balance and allow your body to heal. At the end of the day, you deserve it. Make sure you fill out that survey if you're struggling, and have a great evening.